The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Southwest Drought Status webinar. This webinar series was initiated due to the severity of the drought in the Southwest region, and the webinar will provide the most recent information on the drought, impacts of the drought, and outlook of the drought. In addition, today's webinar will include an update on wildfire conditions and outlook in the region. My name's Elizabeth Waite. I work with the National Integrated Drought Information System, which is part of NOAA. I'm a regional drought information coordinator for NOAA. NOAA's NIDIS, National Integrated Drought Information System. And NIDIS was established to support research on how and why droughts affect society, the economy, and the environment, and to strengthen drought early warning systems across the nation. A key part of the work that we do is coordinating agencies that are key players in drought monitoring, forecasting, planning, and communication. And these agencies have been really involved in putting together this webinar and the series of webinars and drought status updates. And the agencies include NOAA's National Weather Service, USDA, Western Water Assessment, Western Regional Climate Center, Climate Assessment for the Southwest, State Climatologists in the region, the National Drought Mitigation Center, and many others. So today, we are very pleased to have Dr. Nancy Selover. She's Arizona's state climatologist. She will be presenting on the drought in the region and the impacts of the drought and the outlook of the drought. We also are thrilled to have Ed Delgado. He's the National Program Manager for Predictive Services at the National Interagency Fire Center. He's incredibly busy with all the fires going on, so we're really pleased that he can take out a little bit of time in his schedule to share with us on wildfires today. He actually will be talking first before Nancy Selover because he has to go to a meeting. So he will be presenting first on wildfire in the region, and then Nancy will give us an update on the drought conditions and outlook. And then Andrea Baer, with the National Weather Service Western Region, will take Q&A at the end of Nancy and Ed's presentations. So during this call, all attendees are muted. And just type in the questions as you have them. You can type them in now, you can type them in during the presentations or at the end, and then Andrea will help direct the Q&A at the end of the webinar. Finally, the webinar is being recorded. The recording, as well as a 2-page synthesis of the webinar, will be available on drought.gov. And at the end of the webinar, we'll also be listing resources and services to provide you with additional information on drought that you can follow up on. And we welcome your feedback on the webinar. You will be asked to provide that feedback when the webinar closes. So please take a moment to type in whether you found the webinar useful and what additional information you'd like in future webinars. And now I am going to turn over to Ed Delgado, and he will give a presentation on drought and wildfire in the region. Thank you, Ed.
All right, can everybody see my screen?
Yes, I can. Thank you.
All right, excellent. Good morning, everybody. I'm just going to give you a quick overview of where we are right now in the southwestern part of the United States. Let's just jump into it. I always start off with giving people a sense of what we typically see across the United States. On this graph, you see in the red, those are the number of acres burned each year since 1990, and the dashed line is the trend over that period. You can see in terms of acreage, we're actually burning more and more over the last 25 or so years. So there's an upward trend there. Whereas the number of fires has a slight downward trend. That's the yellow line and the yellow dashed line. So you can make draw your own conclusions from that in terms of what's causing that. Obviously, the elephant in the room in this particular case is climate change and a warming environment. But there are also other factors that need to be considered, such as management strategies, just the severity of the fires, the ecosystem that they're burning in, and things like that. So just wanted to give that, kind of put the big picture into perspective in terms of our typical fire season here in the United States. So let's just jump right in. For the Southwest, We're actually kind of heading into the end of the fire season for the southwestern part of the U.S., excluding California, of course. They're always in fire season, it seems like these days. But one of the things that we try to keep track of, especially this time of year, is the precipitation over the last few months. And here I'm looking at the last 90, last 30, and last 7 days. And you can see over the last 3 months, we've had an increase in precipitation across Arizona, into Nevada, parts of California, parts of Utah, southern parts of Utah, and also a little bit of an increase in parts of New Mexico and Colorado, and that's been mostly in the last week to 2 weeks. But why this is important is because this is essentially the southwest monsoon season, and that's usually the shutoff valve for fire season across the southwest, the Four Corners region. And we've seen that pretty much take effect in the last 4 to 6 weeks. When the monsoon kicked in early July, we started to see a huge decline in fire severity, fire size, and numbers of fires. And the reason for that is obviously we're putting precipitation down, moistening the fuels, and even though we're seeing a significant increase in lightning, because the fuel moistures are starting to rise, we're not seeing as many ignitions. And when we do see ignitions, they don't spread very quickly, so we're able to catch them pretty fast and keep them to a relatively small size. And this is typical of the fire season across the Southwest. Once we get into late June, early July, we kind of peak in the number of fires and acres burned, and then we start to see a gradual decline as the monsoon kicks in. Obviously, there are years where the monsoon isn't as active as it was this year, and so we can see some really extreme fire seasons stretch well into July and August. And also, even with a monsoon, we often see a dry, hot period in August where we can start to see an increase in fire activity. We don't anticipate anything really big this year, but whatever we do get is well within the range of normal that we would expect. So fire season is on the decline. It's not completely over. Fire is a natural part of the environment in that part of the country, and it continues certainly well into the end of the summer and early fall, but just at a much reduced intensity by the time we get to the end of the summer. A couple of other things that we like to look at on the left is satellite-based soil moisture, and you can see across the Southwest, southern Nevada, the far southern deserts of California, and all the way across Arizona, most of New Mexico, southern Utah. Quite a bit of soil moisture is sensed by the satellite imagery, and that essentially is our signal that conditions are improving. Soil moistures, vegetation is starting to moisten up. Even the dead fuels like cured grasses and down and dead timber, those are starting to draw moisture in, which reduces the ability to burn or ignite. And we just verify that. If you look at the Vegetation Drought Response Index at the top, you can see it still shows quite a bit of brown and red there. But if you look at the change over the last month, the lower right image, you can see a lot of green that suggests that we're starting to improve the condition in terms of the moisture, the stress on the vegetation down there. There are some areas of concern. You can see very faintly some yellow and maybe some light orange in parts of West Texas and over parts of western Colorado, and even a few pockets down along the Colorado-New Mexico border. Although I think largely those are not in an area that's a huge threat for us right now. And those are areas that we'll still continue to monitor over the coming weeks, where we can still expect to see some fires that can grow to a significant size. But overall, that Southwest region, Four Corners region, their fire season is winding down, and not a huge concern or a huge commitment of resources for us at this time of year. Just quickly looking at the drought, you can see a lot of drought still across the Four Corners region. That's a longer term, a short term and longer term meteorological condition right now. There'll be more about the drought in just a moment. But for our concerns, for our purposes, we're not really expecting that to be a a major critical factor in the remaining part of the fire season in that region. A couple of other things looking at fuel conditions. The top left is 100-hour, which is fuels that are about 1 to 3 inches, and then 1,000-hour, which are fuels that are between 3 and 8 inches. So basically larger branches and maybe small sized trees. Those tend to respond very slowly to changes in moisture. 100-hour is 4 days, 1,000-hour is 40 days. And that's a measure of the intensity of the kind of fire that we could expect in that region. And you can see that they're elevated, but they're not at the highest levels. They're somewhere around the high and some very high categories. But gradually those will start to decrease as we continue to see the rains in those parts of the region, and that'll come down, but not by any stretch of the imagination at any levels right now that we would be really concerned with. If you look at the 100 hours much farther to the northwest across Oregon, Idaho, and northern Nevada, those are areas that we're currently focusing on. And also some areas, like I said, in West Texas that haven't received a lot of precipitation. Those are regions that are a focus for us, and we're monitoring those conditions right now. We do have some active fire in that area, and some of it has caused some control problems for us. But again, overall across the Southwest region, not a big concern. The larger image on the right is what we call the energy release component, another more comprehensive measure of the intensity of fire based on how dry the fuels are and how much fuel is available to burn. And you can see across Arizona, New Mexico, and the far western part of Texas, they've seen quite a bit of improvement over the last 3 to 4 weeks. We still have those dry areas in parts of the panhandle of Texas and the Trans-Pecos region, but also some areas in northern Utah and northwestern Colorado. We've actually picked up some more fires up in that region overnight, and they are creating some concerns. And so that's an area that we're going to continue to watch. But this is just a good indicator of the extent of the monsoon this season. It didn't quite get up far enough north into Colorado and Utah to mitigate the situation there. And so we're still battling fire in that part of the Great Basin and the northern and the central Rockies. Another quick look at a different way of measuring fire danger. This is an objective model that calculates a fire danger index. And you can see the zoomed in version down around the western United States. Still a lot of green out there. It's a little misleading. And again, we have to take this in context with what this particular model measures. And you can see Utah is actually doing pretty well. It's in the moderate range, but there are some other conditions that we look at that tell us give us a different picture. But it is highlighting that area in northwestern Colorado where they haven't had a lot of precipitation. Fuels are dry. And certainly still a concern for fire. Plus, we're still in that lightning season up in that region, so the potential for new starts it still remains elevated. West Texas also still showing some high to very high areas across the panhandle, and again, those are fuels that typically very flashy fuels, so they burn. When you get an ignition, fires tend to spread very quickly, especially if there are windy conditions. So obviously a concern for us there. This is the latest situation of large fires across the United States. You can see most of the fires are concentrated across the Northwest and the Northern Great Basin, and even some along the Rockies. The ones in the black dots are smaller fires. They have a lower level of complexity, still important to us, but they're not posing the kinds of complex problems that we would see with larger fires. However, if you look at northwestern Colorado, you can see we have some blue indicators there. Those are larger fires, more complex, require more resources, and also a higher level, a more experienced management team, in this case, a type 2 team. So that Four Corners region is not entirely out, but for the most part, it's very limited to that far northern part of the Four Corners states. You can see some fires across central Texas, not a huge problem, not really a factor in the west, but there are some fires in parts of West Texas that they are managing. They're smaller, have a smaller complexity at the moment, And conditions aren't favorable for a lot of spread right now, but they're still, the conditions are still favorable for more ignition. So right now we're able to take care of those fires and control them and put them out as quickly as we can. But it just takes a little change in the conditions, maybe a dry cold front moving through that can change the winds, and it could change the character of the fire season in West Texas fairly quickly. This is a closer view of where we are across the West. You can see there's still some active fire out there, but again, the conditions aren't favorable for a lot of spread, so they're able to manage those. Some of them, they're actually managing to let them meet objectives that they would normally try to achieve through prescribed fire. So there's still some fire on the landscape that they're trying to take advantage of and allow it to do some of the habitat and resource management that they would normally do in the spring or maybe later in the fall when conditions are less extreme. And just to give you an idea of where we sit in terms of numbers, Southwest, which is considered Arizona, New Mexico, and West Texas, you can see that so far to date, they've burned about 500,000 acres, just under 500,000 acres, which is pretty much average for this time of year. In terms of number of fires, though, they've almost doubled the number of fires this year compared to normal. So that suggests that a lot of the fires they've had to deal with were they contained them quickly and they didn't spread a lot. So that's a testament to the efforts of the fire community in that part of the country. You can also see a lot of fires still up in Colorado and southern parts of Utah. The purple dots are the fires that are still small. They're just beginning to report those, so we don't have a lot of details in terms of how big they are, but we know they're there. They have been identified as fires. But again, conditions aren't favorable for those to grow really, really big unless they get some extreme local conditions, and so not a significant concern in terms of the amount of effort needed to contain those. So really for the Southwest, we don't have any large-scale extreme fire conditions across most of the region, except that far northwestern corner of Colorado, parts of West Texas over in the Panhandle, and also up in central and northern Utah. But generally, the monsoon has kind of wiped out, as expected, most of the fire season in the Southwest. But again, this is fire season, and so fire is a natural part of the region. And we'll still continue to see fires even though conditions aren't favorable. We just won't see fires that spread rapidly or pose a tremendous amount of containment effort, limitations on the firefighting resources out there. And just quickly, here's our current outlook. You can see we don't have any extremes across that Southwest region except for a little bit of northwestern Utah, and maybe even into parts of Southern California. Which, like I said, typically they're in fire season almost year-round anymore these days. So that's the current outlook. We don't expect any changes in our updated outlook that comes out on August 1st, at least for that region. And that's all I have. And if there are any questions and you guys have the time, I could take a couple now.
Thank you, Ed. Janelle Turner did have a question here. She asked if there's a difference between fires requiring a type 1 management team or a type 2 management team. Is it based on the size of the fire, the type of the fuel, or the cause of the fire, etc.?
It's a combination. They consider a lot of things. First and foremost is what are the values at risk? So in terms of life and property or natural resources or archaeological or historical values, that goes into the consideration. They also look at the complexity of the terrain that the fire is in. And so that determines, obviously the more complex and the more values at risk, they're going to want a more experienced team that is familiar with those kinds of conditions.
So the level type 1 or type 2 has to do with the team that's responding, their level of capacity to address the complexity on the ground.
Exactly. It's not necessarily size, although that might have some weight depending on the fire, but it's primarily the complexity of the fire, the values at risk, and just the level of experience that the team needs to manage that type of fire.
Okay, thank you, Ed. Are there any other questions for Ed before he has to go? And if somebody wants to raise their hand, I can unmute you also, or you could type your question in the question box. There was a question about whether we could do a similar presentation for the Pacific Northwest. I think I can answer that one. This is Elizabeth Waite with NIDIS. I can talk with the regional coordinator for the Pacific Northwest. Ed, have you done one with the Pacific Northwest for NIDIS?
I have done one for the Northwest, yes.
Was that recent?
Yeah, the last one that they had, I believe.
Okay. That was a question from Catherine Rowden. Catherine, I can send you the recording for that. If you could send me your email address, I can put you in touch with a coordinator for the Pacific Northwest, and we can make sure that you get the recording for that, or any follow-up questions you have we can address. And Janelle says, thank you. And thank you for your portion of this seminar, Ed.
You're welcome.
Good. Well, if there are no further questions for Ed, let me just check and see if any hands are up. I don't see any. And I know you're tremendously busy, Ed. We really appreciate your taking time out of the busy fire season to share with us your knowledge and the information you have on fire in the region. So thank you very much, and good luck with everything.
Thank you. Happy to do it.
Okay, now I am going to turn over the presentation mode, if I can. Sorry. Okay, I'm going to turn over to Nancy Selover. Dr. Nancy Selover is the state climatologist for Arizona, and she's going to present on the drought conditions in the Southwest.
Okay, thank you. Welcome. Can you see my screen?
Yes, perfect.
Okay. All right, so we're talking about Southwest drought, so I'm going to proceed. So most of the West is dry, and this is a little down on the left. You've got dust storms across Interstate 10 in southern New Mexico, and we've got really dry range conditions. We've got lakes that are drying up. It's pretty ugly. So we're going to talk about how did we get here. So when we look at the Colorado River Basin precipitation seasonal, so this is cumulative starting at the top left. We go from October through June, and you can see we didn't do very well in October, and we've proceeded to not do very well all the way through June. The dark red is less than 50%, and the lighter red is less than 70% of average precipitation. And until we got into February, we really hardly had anything at all, and even then it wasn't that great. March did a little bit better, but only in northern Colorado and southern southern Wyoming. And then even then, it wasn't doing very well. So it was a pretty ugly situation. Although this is just the Colorado Basin, New Mexico didn't fare that well either. So for the water year, looking at the cumulative water year for the entire region, we see that Utah and New Mexico have suffered just as well as Colorado and Arizona, and northern Colorado did a little bit better, which is nice, but it's not necessarily as good as we would certainly want. It's led to a lot of issues. The departure from normal in terms of temperatures, we're looking at temperatures that were on the order of 2 to 6 degrees warmer than normal in much of Colorado. And we're 2 to 4 degrees warmer than normal in much of Arizona and New Mexico, and even the southeastern half of Utah. So when we did get storms and we did get events, we weren't getting necessarily as much snow as we would like. There was a bunch of places that were getting a lot more rain than they were getting snow. Snow levels got higher, so the heat and the lack of rain were both combined. So here's how the drought progressed across the region in terms of the drought monitor. So we started out, we didn't have that great a monsoon. So when we started, particularly in Arizona, in the southeastern half of Arizona that border with New Mexico, and the mountainous parts of Utah and Colorado, we were already abnormally dry. Not a lot came after that, but the wettest period is not usually happening in October and early or late fall. By the time we got to November, we should have been getting a lot more precipitation, and we weren't getting it. So then we moved into moderate drought. Through December, we had more of nothing, which is more of the same. And by the time we got to winter, where we really would have anticipated a lot of more precipitation and snow, it just got really bad really fast. And that basically proceeded all the way through the rest of the winter. By the time we got to February, we had a lot more areas where we're getting into D3 severe drought, or excuse me, extreme drought, and then and we got into spring, and it progressed really fast. One of the things that I've heard in Arizona is that we did not depict the poor conditions as quickly as we should have. So it got a little bit ahead of us, and we should have depicted it as being worse condition sooner than we actually did. By the time we got to April, we got into exceptional drought in the Four Corners region, and it extended on down sort of towards central Arizona. That continued through May. These are normally our dry months anyway, so I mean, we're looking at 1/10 to 1/4 of an inch of rain. We didn't get it, and so spring grasses wanted to be setting seed. That wasn't happening. Summer came, it got warmer, and we weren't getting any precipitation, so we had a lot of issues with rangeland. We had a whole lot of issues because the winter with not having the precipitation, either rain or snow, stock ponds drying up, lakes drying up, that sort of thing. We had a lot of water hauling that was going on, and you can see it was spread pretty much throughout the entire region. The only place that didn't do so bad is northeastern Colorado, and that was nice for them. It would have been nice if we'd had that kind of condition, at least in the Rockies. So moving on. So the reservoir levels. Utah and Colorado. So Utah, the northern part, is not too bad relative to normal. Some of it's controlled, but also it was because they had a good leftover amount of precipitation from the previous winter, which did really well. And there was some snowmelt coming in from Wyoming, so that was helpful. Further south, it got drier. There was less snow. There was less precipitation, and so the reservoirs to the south got a lot worse. Same sort of thing happened in Colorado. So we have some certainly controlled and managed reservoirs that weren't doing too bad in the northern part of the basin, but when you get down further toward the southern part of the basin, as you saw previously, we didn't have any precipitation, and so it just got worse and worse and worse downstream as you move through the Colorado. When we look at Arizona, we have over on the Colorado River. On western Arizona, we have very managed lakes with Mojave and Havasu, and they tend to keep them pretty full because that's providing irrigation water that goes off to California. The Salt River is running around, let's see, the salt is, where's my numbers? The salt's about 55% of capacity. Over there, Salt River Project's been doing a real good job of managing it and trying to maintain that. Partly there wasn't a lot of snow melt that came down, but they've also been managing it through shifting the water supplies from just reservoir systems and surface water to some groundwater and some CAP water. So they do a balancing act there. The Verde's only 28%, but that's not totally unusual because the Verde doesn't really have a lot of capacity. And then San Carlos is now at 27%, which just increased a bit. It had been lower than that. And when we look up to Powell and Meade, we're seeing Powell at 52% and Lake Meade at 37%. And I will talk more about those in a second. When we look into New Mexico, Navajo Reservoir is at 68%. That's probably one of the best in the northern part of the state, in the northwestern part of the state. Most of the northern reservoirs seem to be kind of holding their own, although they're all much lower, less than half of their capacity. The southern reservoirs are extremely dry because they really haven't had much. Elephant Butte shows that it's 10% on this graph, but it's currently down, I believe, down to 7%. Some information that I just got from Dave Dubois. So it's in dire straits. Let's see. Okay, so moving on to Powell and Meade. So we have in the upper right, we have Lake Powell. It's at 3605.53 feet. It's down almost 30 feet from a year ago. And that's an issue. Well, equalizing flows isn't necessarily going to be a big deal at this point in time. Lake Meade's down to 1,077.42 feet. So it's 2.42 feet above the first stage of shortage. But we're not anticipating still that they're going to be going to shortage at the end of this year. But unless we have a really good winter in this coming winter, it's very likely that we will end up in a shortage by the end of next year. Daily stream flow. So the stream flow is an issue. Southwestern Colorado is extremely low in terms of its stream flow, as is northwestern New Mexico. And we've been seeing streams running dry and creeks drying up. And this is a problem. Certainly central and northern Utah have also had the same sort of an issue. When you look down to southern Arizona over in the southwest, you see blue that looks kind of rosy and cheerful, but it's not necessarily the way it looks, because we typically have very low flows along the Gila and the tributaries that flow into the lower Gila. And the same thing with the Little Colorado up there in northeastern Arizona. The flows aren't usually that large, so it's saying it's a little bit above normal, but the reality is they're still having some issues with those. Okay, some impacts. One of the things that I want to talk about is not written on this slide, and that is the wild horses. In the Four Corners areas, the Four Corner states, we've got wild horses that are dying from lack of water and lack of forage. So there's not a lot of grazing going on the rangeland because not many of those grasses came up. And so the horses are, one, starving, and two, they're dying of thirst. We have a lot of volunteers in northern Arizona, just north of Flagstaff, up on the Navajo Nation, that have been hauling water and bringing hay to the wild horses and other feed. We have similar conditions that are going on in Utah and Colorado with the wild horses having significant problems. In Colorado, southwestern Colorado, the La Plata and Montezuma counties, the price of hay has doubled because they're having issues with streams and creeks drying up, so they're not able to get irrigation water onto the hay fields, so they're not able to grow hay. So the supply of hay has reduced, and the demand for it certainly has not reduced at all. So people are culling their herds for lack of both feed and water. As I said before, creeks and streams are drying up. In the tourism industry in southwestern Colorado, you have winter skiing, you have summer hiking and sightseeing that would normally be happening. We didn't have a lot of snow, so the winter skiing wasn't very good. Then we had the fire issue in southern Colorado, and that's caused people not to come. So tourism is down, so the economics is down as well. In Northwest and the Central Rockies, they're still waiting for the monsoon moisture. Hopefully it will get there, but we're not holding our breath. At least I'm not holding my breath. We've had hotter than normal temperatures, and so the reservoirs have taken a big hit with water demand. There was some good carryover for some of those reservoirs, as I said, but the reservoir storage is now below normal in general. They also had down in the southern part, because of the monsoon and because of the fire, there was some flooding on Highway 550 from the 416 burn scar. And so there's stock tanks are dry and other kinds of water issues are happening. There's the 416 fire on the right. The runoff is all sludge. There's basically no soil infiltration happening at all. So when the monsoon precipitation hits, it comes down and it brings this ugly sludge with it. Now the picture on the left is not a turd. This is the sludge that's being washed down from the burn scar. These photos are courtesy of Becky Bollinger. And let's see. Okay, so Utah impacts. The Tule, Salt Lake, Davis, Weber, Morgan, Box Elder, Cache, and Rich counties in northwestern and north central Utah have had a drought declaration after they had the warmest and least snowy winter since the 1800s. Irrigation water is a problem in many areas. There's a lot of worry about debris flows and water quality from the burn scars, from the burns that we saw earlier. Also found out that there's water restrictions in St. George down in southwestern Utah. In Arizona, Mojave County is still hauling water, and there's some springs that are still dry from winter. So the dry winter and spring was worse than the drought depictions. I was saying we didn't pick up on this early enough to get it into as poor a category as it should have been. Southeast and northeastern Arizona are still lagging in monsoon rainfall after this very dry winter. So they're still having some significant conditions and impacts up there and down there. Groundwater levels are dropping across much of the state as crops are irrigated. So as I said, Selover Project's managing our reservoir system to maintain a level in the surface reservoirs, but so part of that has to do with increased groundwater pumping. Other parts of the state that don't get the Salton Verde water, which is mostly the Phoenix metropolitan area, the rest of the state typically relies on either groundwater or in some cases the CAP water, and so groundwater levels are dropping, so there's subsidence issues continuing to go on across the state. New Mexico impacts. So the governor just made a drought declaration because over 90% of the state's in extreme D3 or exceptional D4 drought. 20% of the states in D4. Most of the basins received only 30 to 40% of their normal precipitation in this water year so far. And here's a graph of what's going on at Elephant Butte Reservoir. It came from Dave Dubois. So last year at this point they were at about 19% of capacity, and this year they're about 7%. Ranchers are supplementing, bringing in supplemental feed. There's a couple isolated places that are doing okay, not necessarily from winter, but because they've started to get some spotty monsoon precipitation. But it is in fact very, very spotty, and so that's a problem. Current wildfires, those are all sizes, they aren't just big ones. And I show you this because you got a lot of information from Ed, but these are areas, even if these are no longer such a problem going forward, or they're anticipated to be contained. Some of them are probably very close to being contained. These are all areas where we had significant fires, and when we get monsoon precipitation, particularly at the higher elevations and in the rugged terrain, we will have significant issues from flooding, from the runoff, and from debris flows and water quality issues and all those kinds of things as well. Okay, so looking at the monsoon the last 30 and the last 7 days, the percentage of normal precipitation. So if we look at western Arizona, it seems to be doing pretty good so far in this. But early July is not really the wettest part of the monsoon for the western part of the state. And so even though these may be 200 to 400, 600, 800% of normal is not a whole lot. So it's nice that we got this, but it doesn't mean all these places are now actually wet. So the northeast, as I said, and the southeast are lagging. The Mogollon Rim has done pretty well so far, and that's helped a lot with that fire issue. And so we'll hope to continue, but again, the flooding's potential, because we've been seeing more and more wetter monsoon events. So we get maybe not necessarily more or less actual rain events, but we're potentially seeing some more localized heavy precipitation falling from them. And so if those are falling over the burn scars, we have some significant issues. New Mexico has been very dry, except for west central, and it's been a little spotty to the north. So so far the monsoon hasn't done a whole lot of good for most of New Mexico. And in Utah, there's a little bit of precipitation that's been going on in southern Utah, but they haven't been seeing it move to northern Utah. Same thing with Colorado. The activity hasn't really gotten up there to be giving us a lot of help with potential fire issues, because they do, as Ed said, they do have the lightning still happening. The 7 to 10 day, the 7-day precipitation, and mine's 2 days, not as new as Ed's picture, but really a lot of this precipitation that we've been seeing has actually been happening over just the last week. So the monsoon was a little slow to get started, and we're still hoping it will ramp up better. As we look forward to the future, we look at the August CPC forecast outlook. So on the left, we've got the temperature for August. We have a high probability that we're going to be warmer than average. That seems to be the normal statement. So it's like normal is warmer than average. And then when we look at the right, we're looking at higher probability than equal chances of having a wetter August than we would normally have, and that's particularly the case for Utah and Arizona, but only for the western half of Colorado and New Mexico. We look at the 3-month outlook beyond that, August through October, same story, potentially warmer than normal temperatures and wetter than normal situation. And then when we move to the winter, the forecast is looking at, again, a little better probability for a warmer than average winter and a wetter than average winter for most of the of the Four Corner states. And largely that's based on the El Nino situation that they seem to be seeing. So mentioning that, CPC's forecast is now for 65 to 70% probability of El Nino this winter, and it's at somewhere between a weak and a moderate El Nino. So that's where we're going. I don't hold my breath on this, and the reason I don't is because we've been teased before where, oh, it looks like El Nino, and then nothing happened, and then it collapses. And so I don't hold my breath. I'm always hopeful. I'm looking forward to it, and I wish that will be the case, but we'll see what happens. As you know, just because we have higher, warmer than normal sea temperatures, we also need to be getting that circulation pattern in place that's going to bring us those storms, to bring us that rain. Now, looking back at what we've had in previous El Ninos, these are strong El Nino winters, and as we look at the 82, 83, it was pretty good for Arizona and southern Utah and western New Mexico and northeastern Colorado, but not for the mountains in Colorado. So that was not necessarily the best thing ever. When we get to 97, 98, that was what they called the Godzilla El Nino, my favorite term. And we had sea surface temperatures that were 3 degrees warmer than normal Celsius, which seemed to be okay for a lot of the place. It wasn't the wettest we've ever had. But again, it didn't do much for the Rockies, and it didn't do much for the Wasatch in terms of our snowpack, so that wasn't so great. And then when we get to the 2015-2016 one, that was just supposed to be just exactly like the Godzilla one, or even worse, better, whatever. It was a dud pretty much completely, except for northeastern Colorado. So I would hope that I think we actually do better with weak to moderate El Ninos than we do with strong ones for some of our areas. But we'll wait and see what happens. I hope El Nino does in fact develop, but at this point I would even settle for a standard good old normal winter precipitation. And that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. As we transition into the Q&A session, again, we have Nancy on the phone. Ed had to get off the phone, but as you can see on the slide that Elizabeth just put up, that is Elizabeth's email. And so if you have any more questions for Ed, she can pass those on and get those answered for you. Also, if you're thinking about the webinar a little later and the information you've heard and you have additional questions, please do send those Elizabeth's way and she will facilitate that. She also has put a great list together of resources that you can go to and look up various information that you may need to go with the drought as we move through this. So please utilize that. And at this time, I'm going to ask you to start typing in any questions you have for Nancy in the questions box on the display panel there. Let's see, I'm getting one. And then I will mention to you guys, I'm going to actually have everyone do the questions this way, and then I'll go and see if anyone's raised their hands. You can do it that way, and then I'll come back one more time to this question box. So we'll try and get everyone's questions answered. So I do have one question for you, Nancy. Let's see. It is, well, I don't have a name. It's a newcomer. Is a monsoon declared when temperatures and moisture equal a certain number?
Okay. We used to define it by if for Phoenix, if we had 3 consecutive days with the average daily dew point 55 or higher, then the first day of that occurrence became the start of the monsoon. And because that was determined for the Phoenix area to be a high enough dew point that we would actually be able to have at least 1 inch of precipitable water above the area, which was assumed to be enough to actually get some rain to actually hit the ground, as opposed to Virga. In 2008, the National Weather Service decided to change to have the monsoon be a season, and the reason is because it could be consistent across the area. One. Number two, people used to say, oh, we can't have a storm because we haven't had a 55-degree dew point yet. Well, we could still get a storm. And so they wanted people to just be aware the season has started. Now is the time to be looking and be aware of potential for storms. So it's been a little bit of both, a season and we actually had values.
Okay, thank you, Nancy. And then I'll wait a few more minutes and see if anyone's added any more questions. I do want to mention Elizabeth just changed the slide, and what's on the top above the word upcoming events, all of that are continuous different webinars, briefings, things like that that go on throughout the West and that may be of interest to you. Also, the Drought Impact Reporter for folks feeling drought impacts. The National Drought Mitigation Center keeps track of those, so it's a great place to go and provide information on the impacts you're feeling. And then upcoming events, these are different meetings that are going to be coming up, and so Elizabeth will add to these each time we have a webinar, so just wanted to call your attention to that. And let me see if I have any more questions in here. I do not, so I am going to go to see if anyone has their hand raised. And let's see. Oh, I already answered that one. I apologize, Joni. I thought you were putting newcomer as your as your name, but it was Joni Newcomer. I apologize for that. Okay, I don't see anyone's hand raised at this time, and I don't see any more questions. So we will go ahead and end the webinar. And as Elizabeth mentioned at the beginning, the recording and the 2-page summary will be available in a couple of days at the website at the very top of the slide you see now. So please check back and look for that 2-pager and the recording. And thank you so much to Nancy and Ed for your information today. And we will see you next time. Thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.